In the heart of the Appalachian Hills lies a story that's been quietly unfolding for decades, but it wasn't until recently that the world took notice. Loraine Whittaker, a man who barely speaks, lives in the shadows of a family often dubbed America's most inbred. But the truth behind his life, his silence, and his family's isolated existence is far more complex than the viral videos would have you believe. For Loraine, the camera has been a constant presence, watching, but never truly understanding. What happens when the world sees you but never really looks? And what do we miss when we only see what's in front of us? Loraine's story isn't about genetics. It's about the quiet defiance of living life without the need for validation. Let's uncover the life of Loraine Whittaker, a man who has lived under a microscope for years and yet remains unseen. Before we dive deeper, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and share this video. This story needs to be heard, and your support helps it reach those who will truly listen. Loraine Whittaker lives in a secluded house hidden deep in the hills of West Virginia. The house, weathered by time, is tucked away from the bustling world, offering him the peace of solitude. His life has always been one of quiet simplicity, defined by the rhythmic pace of daily existence. Every action, every movement seems predetermined, carried out with a sense of familiarity that makes up his world. For Loraine, the concept of time is fluid. He doesn't mark the days with calendars or clocks, but with routines that unfold steadily, each action building on the next, forming the fabric of his life. The home he inhabits is modest and worn, much like the life it shelters. The creaking floors, the faded walls, the worn-out furniture, it's all part of Loraine's universe, where nothing new ever really disrupts his peaceful existence. Inside, the rhythm of Loraine's life unfolds in the simplest ways. He moves from one space to another, sometimes pausing to look out the window, lost in thought, or perhaps waiting for something to happen. There are no rushes, no expectations. The outside world continues to turn, but in Loraine's home, the days pass with a predictability that makes him feel grounded, like the earth beneath his feet knows him well. Though he rarely speaks, Loraine is never truly absent. His movements, however small, are carefully observed by those around him. He communicates in ways that transcend words, in actions and expressions that speak volumes. His brothers, Timmy and Ray, share the space with him. Like Loraine, they rarely speak but understand one another through subtle exchanges. They are bound by more than blood. They share a life, a silence, and a home. The house is not quiet in the traditional sense. It is filled with sounds, the rustling of leaves outside, the creaking of old wood, the occasional grunt or movement from Loraine and his brothers, signaling a life in motion. For Loraine, the silence is not oppressive. It is simply a part of who he is. His lack of words is not a sign of absence, but a way of existing in his space without the need for constant noise. Loraine doesn't need the world to understand him. His world is here, in the hills of West Virginia, and that's all that matters. The outside world may look, but it will never truly see him for who he is. Though he rarely leaves the house, Loraine is aware of his surroundings. He senses when something changes, when someone enters or leaves. His world is small, but it's a world he has learned to navigate perfectly. Visitors come occasionally, drawn by curiosity or the fame of the Whittaker family, but Loraine never reacts to their presence. He doesn't seek attention, doesn't need their validation. He is content with his own rhythms. Timmy, his brother, often moves through the house with a similar calmness. He doesn't speak much either, but he is an ever-present part of the landscape. The two brothers coexist, sharing the space without the need for constant interaction. The house, though old and crumbling, feels familiar. Each corner, each window, each creak of the floor has its place in the routine that Loraine follows. It's not a place of great excitement, but of simple, steady life. Loraine doesn't feel the need to perform for anyone, least of all the camera. The world may watch, may comment, may wonder, but to him, the quiet life he leads is enough. He doesn't ask for more. Occasionally, Lawrence will glance at the camera, but he never plays to it. His stillness is not an act for anyone but himself. The attention from the outside world is as foreign to him as the people who visit. His brothers, Timmy and Ray, also live this way. They don't speak to the camera, don't acknowledge the attention. They live as they have always lived, together in silence, in the comfort of the world they've built. For Lawrence, the house isn't a prison. It's a sanctuary. The outside world may look in, may even offer help or charity, but Lawrence doesn't need it. He doesn't seek anything from anyone beyond what he already has. As the days pass, Lawrence continues his routine. The world may notice him, may point and stare, but none of it changes the rhythm of his life. He lives without the need for approval, without asking for anything at all. In his quiet, simple existence, Loraine Whittaker has found his place. The outside world might view him as a curiosity, but he is a man of resilience, living his life in the way that works best for him. The Whittaker family's origins can be traced back to two brothers, John and Henry, whose bond formed the foundation of a pattern that would continue for generations. Their union gave rise to a family bound by blood and history. John and Henry were not just brothers, but the beginning of a larger cycle. Their descendants, while cousins, grew even closer through marriage, often marrying within their own family, creating a unique bond of genetics. This practice of marrying within the family became a tradition, repeated through the generations. Over time, the Whittaker name came to represent more than just a family. It became a symbol of isolation, of a world defined by its own bloodline. For Loraine Whittaker, this pattern was both a blessing and a curse. Born into a family where the lines between cousins and siblings blurred, his life was shaped by decisions made long before he was born. The repeated marriages within the family created a genetic echo, with each new generation carrying the weight of the family's past. As Lawrence grew older, he began to feel the effects of this isolated upbringing, marked by physical and neurological traits passed down through the generations. But the Whittaker family wasn't just defined by their genetics. They were men with their own stories, with their own lives, living in a way that felt natural to them. Lawrence and his brothers had their own world, their own rhythm. The small, secluded town of Odd, West Virginia became the backdrop for the Whittaker family's lives. Its isolation was both a blessing and a curse, keeping the family protected from the outside world, but also limiting their interactions with society. As the years passed, the Whittakers continued to marry within their own family, a practice that, while frowned upon by outsiders, became a part of their identity. To them, it was simply a way of life. The effects of this isolation were seen in Lawrence and his brothers. Their lives were shaped by the choices of their ancestors, each generation carrying forward the genetic legacy of the family's past. But despite the challenges they faced, the Whittaker brothers never allowed themselves to be defined by their genetic history. They lived their lives quietly, sticking to their routines and surviving in the only way they knew how. For Lawrence, this family history was something he could never escape. It was a part of him, as much a part of his identity as the silence that defined his life. The family's genetic legacy was both a burden and a bond. Despite the challenges, the Whittaker men were survivors. They had learned to live within the confines of their world, finding comfort in the patterns and routines that kept them grounded in their isolation. But their isolation was not without its consequences. The world outside began to take notice, and with that attention came judgment. The Whittaker name, once just a family label, was now a symbol of something darker, something misunderstood. For Lawrence and his brothers, this attention was unsettling. They had never asked for it. They had never sought the spotlight. But as the outside world began to look in, they were no longer able to live in peace. The family's history, once a private matter, became a public spectacle. The world judged them based on their appearance, their silence, their genetics. But for Lawrence, the family's past was something to be accepted, not something to be ashamed of. Through it all, Loraine Whittaker and his brothers remained a close-knit unit. Their bond, forged through years of living in isolation, was unbreakable. They didn't need the approval of the outside world to survive. They had each other. Loraine Whittaker lives a life defined by stillness. The rhythm of his day is not marked by time, but by familiarity. The sounds, the movements, the patterns that make up his quiet existence in the hills of West Virginia. Each day unfolds in a simple, predictable manner. Lawrence wakes, moves, and interacts in ways that feel natural to him. There's no rush, no urgency, only the steady beat of routine that keeps his world grounded. Though he doesn't speak, Lawrence communicates in ways that are understood by his brothers. His movements, his presence, his actions all convey more than words ever could. In silence, he has found his own form of expression. For Lawrence, stillness is not a sign of absence, but of presence. He doesn't need words to exist. His life is full of small actions, gestures, eye movements, shifts in posture that tell those around him exactly what he means. The house where Lawrence lives with his brothers is a place of constant, quiet motion. The creaking of the floors, the occasional hum of a task being completed, and the sounds of his brothers moving through their day, these are the only signals he needs. Timmy, Lawrence's brother, shares this silent rhythm. He moves through the house with a similar calmness, communicating in his own way, yet always in sync with the others. Their world is a constant exchange of subtle gestures and unspoken understanding. Though outsiders may view Lawrence's silence as strange, to those who know him, it's simply a way of life. The quiet that fills the house is not an emptiness, but a way of being. It's a comfort, a certainty. There are moments when Lawrence looks out the window or sits motionless, his gaze fixed on something far beyond the walls. These moments aren't signs of confusion or detachment, but reflections in his own unique rhythm of life. His brother Ray, though more vocal, contributes his own layer of noise to the house. His grunts and sounds fill the space, but even his presence becomes part of the balance, a living counterpoint to Lawrence's stillness. Despite the minimal spoken word, Lawrence and his brothers form a deep connection. Their lives, though filled with silence, are not isolated. They share a bond that transcends language, an understanding that doesn't require explanation. The house itself holds the same rhythm. The walls creak, the wind rustles through the trees outside, and every corner of the house has its own distinct sound. For Lawrence, this rhythm is home. It is all he needs. Time in the house passes in cycles, not dictated by hours or minutes, but by habits. Lawrence eats when food is brought to him, rests when it feels right, and moves only when necessary. Each action done at the right moment. Though the world outside may seem chaotic and loud, Lawrence's life remains consistent. His world is predictable. It doesn't change because of external forces. His routine, his rhythm, remains constant no matter what happens outside the house. When visitors arrive, Lawrence remains unchanged. The presence of others doesn't disrupt his rhythm. He doesn't react to the camera or the attention. He simply continues with his life as if nothing has altered his world. For Lawrence, silence is not a void, but a space in which he is fully present. He may not speak, but that doesn't mean he is absent. His presence is felt in every part of the house, in every small movement he makes. The silence that defines Lawrence's life is often misunderstood. The world sees it as an absence, as if there is something missing. But for him, silence is a form of living, a rhythm he's come to rely on. His brothers, too, have learned to live with this rhythm. They don't need words to understand each other. Every day they go about their tasks in perfect harmony, guided by the unspoken connection that binds them together. Though the outside world may see their quiet lives as something to be fixed, Lawrence and his brothers have found peace in it. They don't need validation. They don't need to be understood. They simply need to exist, together, in silence. Loraine Whittaker had never asked for the world to see him, but in the digital age, everything changes. What was once a quiet life in the hills of West Virginia quickly became a spectacle for millions. The viral videos that captured the Whittaker family's daily lives introduced them to a global audience. Lawrence, silent and still, became the face of a story that the world was eager to watch, but didn't fully understand. When the first videos emerged, they were raw, unfiltered, and uncomfortably intimate. They showed Lawrence in his quiet moments, captured in frames that focused on his stillness. This silence, though unnoticed by many, was what stood out most to the viewers. The attention that followed was overwhelming. The quiet, unassuming life of Lawrence and his brothers had been thrust into the spotlight, and they could do nothing to escape it. The cameras were always present, recording their every move. For Lawrence, the cameras were not just an intrusion, they became a constant companion. The world saw him, but it didn't truly understand him. To them, he was just another subject, another oddity to be analyzed and dissected. Despite his silence, the world wanted Lawrence to speak. They wanted him to perform, to react, to show emotion. But he remained unmoved. He didn't perform for the camera, and he didn't seek the attention. His life continued as it always had, quiet and unperturbed. As the videos gained more views, the Whittakers became an online sensation. Donations poured in, people visited to offer help, and the world wanted to offer their sympathy. Yet Lawrence remained untouched by it all, uninterested in the attention he had never asked for. The viral fame brought both good and bad. While some saw the attention as a blessing, bringing help and resources to the Whittaker family, others criticized the videos, calling them exploitative, reducing a complex life to a spectacle for entertainment. For Lawrence, the cameras only highlighted the disconnection between the outside world and his own reality. He didn't need their help. He didn't ask for anything. Yet the world continued to intrude, viewing his silence as a challenge, as something to be solved. The outside world saw Lawrence's stillness and assumed something was wrong. They looked at him and saw only what they wanted to see, a man who was different, a man who needed fixing. But Lawrence didn't need to be fixed. He was content in his quiet life. The viral fame also brought a strange sense of isolation. Although they were being watched by millions, the Whittaker family was no more understood than before. The attention didn't bridge the gap between the world's perception of them and their reality. For Lawrence, the fame only reinforced the sense of being an outsider. He didn't understand the obsession with his life, nor did he care. He was just a man living his life, quietly, in the hills of West Virginia. The rest of the world could watch, but it would never truly understand. Though the cameras were always there, Lawrence remained unfazed. He didn't perform for them, didn't give in to the pressures that came with fame. His life was still his own, unaltered by the world's scrutiny. He had never asked to be a symbol. The fame also brought visitors, some well-meaning, some simply curious. They came to observe, to offer help, to take photographs. But Lawrence didn't react. His brothers, too, remained unmoved by the attention. They didn't ask for anything. They didn't need anything from the outside world. Through it all, Lawrence remained unchanged. The world's attention, the donations, the visitors, it all meant little to him. His life continued in its quiet rhythm, unaffected by the noise outside. He didn't need validation. He didn't need pity. He only needed to exist. Even as the viral fame grew, Lawrence never deviated from his routine. The world's gaze may have fixed on him, but his life, his world, was a place where fame could not penetrate. He lived on his terms, without the need for outside approval. For Lawrence, The viral fame was a reminder that the world will always look for a story, a narrative to follow. But his life, his silent defiance of that narrative, was a story that the world would never truly understand. The Whittaker family's story is often reduced to a single stigmatizing label: America's most inbred. This phrase, though widely recognized, does little to capture the complex reality of their lives. It's a label that oversimplifies their history, their struggles, and their humanity. For Loraine Whittaker and his brothers, the label is more than just a word. It is a burden that has followed them for generations. It doesn't just define their physical appearance. It defines how the world sees them, without truly knowing them. The Whittaker family's history is one of isolation, not by choice, but by circumstance. The family's roots began with two brothers, John and Henry, whose descendants formed the foundation of the family line. Over generations, marriages between close relatives became the norm. As the years passed, the family's genetic makeup became more isolated. The repeated marriages within the family created a genetic echo that could be traced through each new generation. By the time Loraine was born, the effects were apparent in his physical and mental development. But Loraine and his brothers are not defined by their genetics alone. Their lives have been shaped by the choices of their ancestors, but they are more than the sum of their family history. They are men, not symbols of something darker or misunderstood. The world often sees Loraine and his brothers through the lens of genetics. The label inbred is slapped onto their existence, reducing them to a single characteristic, something they cannot escape. But this label ignores the depth of their lives, their humanity. For Loraine, this label is not something he chooses to wear, but something that is thrust upon him by outsiders. It doesn't define his identity, but it shapes how he is perceived by the world. He is more than just the product of his family's history. The label inbred carries with it a heavy weight. It is used to explain away the family's differences, to reduce them to a scientific curiosity rather than individuals with their own stories. But Loraine and his brothers are not a case study. They are people. Despite the challenges brought on by their isolated upbringing, the Whittaker brothers continue to live their lives. They face difficulties, but they are not defined by them. Their existence is not tragic. It is simply their reality. The label doesn't account for the resilience that has kept the Whittakers alive. It doesn't explain how they've managed to survive in isolation without the help of the outside world. Loraine and his brothers have lived on their own terms, creating their own world. For Loraine, the label is a reflection of how the world chooses to see him, not who he truly is. He doesn't fit into the narrow categories that society has defined for him. He is not a symbol of inbreeding. He is a man, living his life. The Whittaker brothers don't need the world's approval. They've never asked for it. Their way of life may be misunderstood, but it is theirs, and it is all they know. The outside world can judge, but that judgment will never change their reality. The label inbred is used to explain the physical and mental differences in the Whittaker family, but it doesn't tell the full story. It doesn't explain the bond between Loraine and his brothers, the quiet understanding that holds their world together. Even though the world may see them as a curiosity, Loraine and his family have created a life that is uniquely their own. The label inbred can never capture the complexity of their existence, the depth of their relationships, or the strength they have found in each other. The label, though widely known, is just one part of a much larger story. It's a story that the world has failed to understand, focusing instead on the surface level of genetics rather than the depth of human connection that Loraine and his brothers share. Despite the label, despite the judgments, Loraine continues to live his life. He does not let the world define him. He does not need their approval. He is simply a man living his life, and that is all he needs. For Loraine Whittaker, silence is not a void. It is a way of being. It's how he communicates, how he exists in the world, and how he connects with his brothers. But the world doesn't understand this. To them, silence is something to be fixed. Lawrence's stillness often confuses those who look at him from the outside. They see a man who doesn't speak, a man who remains motionless, and they assume that something must be wrong. But for Lawrence, his silence is simply how he lives. There is no emptiness in his quiet existence. Every movement, every gesture, is part of the language that Lawrence has learned to use. His brothers, Timmy and Ray, understand him without the need for words. They have lived with him long enough to know what he means with a simple look or a small shift in posture. For Lawrence, silence is not a barrier, it is a bridge. It connects him to those who understand it. It doesn't separate him from the world. It allows him to exist within it without the need for constant noise or verbal communication. The world, however, doesn't see it that way. Silence is often viewed as a problem, a symptom of something wrong. People see Lawrence's stillness and assume he is less than they are, less capable, less human, less deserving of attention. But Lawrence has always known how to navigate the world in his own way. He doesn't need to speak to be heard. His presence, his movements, his gaze, all of these things communicate more than words ever could. The way the world perceives Lawrence's silence is a misunderstanding. They look at him and see a man who is mute, who doesn't interact. But they miss the complexity of his life. They miss the subtle language that exists between him and his brothers. For Lawrence, his silence is a form of connection, not isolation. The world may not understand it, but his brothers do. They know how to interpret his silence, just as they know how to communicate without words. In the house where Lawrence and his brothers live, silence is not a lonely thing. It is part of their routine, part of their existence. The quiet of the house is filled with meaning, filled with connection. Visitors may come and go, but they don't understand Lawrence the way his brothers do. They see the silence and make assumptions, but they don't see the world that Lawrence shares with Timmy and Ray. They don't see the bond that exists between them. For Lawrence, his life isn't about being noticed or understood. It's about being present, living in the way that feels natural to him. His silence is not something that needs to be fixed. It is simply who he is. The world often overlooks the importance of silence. It assumes that silence equals emptiness. But for Lawrence, silence is a space where meaning is created. His stillness is not a lack of communication. It is a different form of it. To Lawrence and his brothers, silence is a language that works for them. They don't need to speak to know what the other is thinking. A glance, a gesture, a shared moment. These are all ways they communicate. The misunderstanding of Lawrence's silence reflects a deeper societal issue, the need to define everything, to label everything, to put things into neat categories. Lawrence doesn't fit into those categories, and that is something the world struggles to accept. In his silence, Lawrence finds peace. He doesn't need the world's approval, nor does he need to explain himself. His life is simple, and that simplicity is something the world often misunderstands. But it is enough for him. Through it all, Lawrence continues to live his life in silence. The world may not understand him, but he doesn't need them to. His silence is his strength, his way of being in a world that often demands more than he's willing to give. When the Whittaker family's private life became public, it brought more than just attention. It brought change, and not always the kind they could handle. For Lawrence Whittaker, the sudden exposure to millions was a disruption to the quiet world he had always known. Before the videos, Lawrence and his brothers had lived in isolation, untouched by the outside world. Their days were spent in the familiar rhythm of their home, free from the prying eyes of others. But once the cameras came, that peace was shattered. The viral videos, meant to capture the family's unusual way of life, quickly turned Lawrence and his brothers into internet sensations. But this attention came with a cost, one that Lawrence never asked for, and never wanted. The fame brought with it a barrage of visitors, curious onlookers, strangers with good intentions, and those looking for answers to questions they hadn't yet formulated. Lawrence didn't ask for their sympathy, their donations, or their concern. But it came anyway. With every new video, with every new comment, Lawrence and his brothers became more and more visible. The world was watching, but no one truly understood their lives. They were reduced to a spectacle, and their reality became just another form of entertainment. The attention didn't just change the way the world saw Lawrence, it changed how others saw his family. People who had once lived quietly in their corner of the world were now forced to deal with the scrutiny that came with viral fame. Though some saw the media exposure as a blessing, bringing them food, clothing, and medical attention, Lawrence never welcomed the intrusion. The attention felt unnatural, and he didn't need it to survive. He had always lived without it, and he preferred it that way. The viral videos, though they brought donations and offers of help, also served to strip away the privacy the Whittakers once had. Their home, once a private sanctuary, was now open to the world, and with that exposure came a loss of control over their own narrative. For Lawrence, the world's gaze was both unsettling and uninvited. He wasn't interested in the fame, nor did he understand why anyone would want to watch his quiet life. He never asked for attention. He never wanted to be a spectacle. The world's judgment was a heavy weight on the Whittaker brothers. Every word, every glance, every moment of their lives was now up for public consumption. They were no longer just men living in peace. They were figures to be analyzed, dissected, and commented on. Lawrence had always lived without the need for outside approval. But with the exposure came a pressure to conform, to react, to be something for the world to witness. But he refused. He stayed true to the silence and routine that defined his life. As the cameras kept rolling, Lawrence remained unchanged. His life went on as it always had, a quiet existence, a rhythm that no amount of attention could disrupt. But that didn't mean the exposure didn't take its toll. The visitors, the media, the donations, they all came with the price of being watched. Lawrence wasn't sure what he was supposed to do with this newfound attention. He didn't need help. He didn't need pity. He needed nothing from anyone. For Lawrence, the real cost of exposure was not the donations or the help they received. It was the loss of privacy, the loss of peace. He had never asked for the world to see him, and now he couldn't escape it. Despite the world's attention, Lawrence continued to live his life. He didn't react to the cameras, didn't respond to the visitors. His world was the same as it had always been, a quiet, solitary place where he could exist without the need for validation. Though the fame changed the way others saw him, Lawrence never allowed it to change how he saw himself. He was still the same man who had always lived in the hills of West Virginia, in his own world, in his own rhythm. The exposure, though uncomfortable, didn't break Lawrence. It didn't change who he was. His life was still his own, and in the face of the world's gaze, he remained steadfast, unwavering in his silence and his existence. In a world that values visibility and noise, Lawrence Whittaker's quiet existence is a form of defiance. He never sought attention, never craved the spotlight, but the world couldn't help but focus on him. Yet, through it all, Lawrence remains unchanged. Lawrence doesn't need the world to see him. He doesn't need the approval of others to validate his existence. In his silence, in his stillness, there is a quiet strength that the outside world struggles to understand. For most, living a life under constant scrutiny would be unbearable. But for Lawrence, it has become an act of quiet resistance. He doesn't react to the noise. He doesn't respond to the judgment. He simply lives. Lawrence has never asked for attention. He has never tried to gain the world's approval. Yet, despite the viral fame, the donations, and the visits, Lawrence remains unmoved. His existence is his own, and he holds on to it fiercely. The world may look at him and see only what it wants to see: a figure trapped in silence, a symbol of something misunderstood. But Lawrence refuses to let them define him. He is more than just an image on a screen. In his stillness, Lawrence says more than words ever could. His quiet defiance is a statement that doesn't need to be heard. He is a man who exists outside the world's expectations, and in doing so, he challenges those expectations. Even as the world watches, Lawrence remains present, but never performative. His silence is not an absence of life, it is full of meaning. It is a form of living that doesn't require validation or recognition from the outside world. For Lawrence, existence is about being true to oneself, not about conforming to societal standards. He doesn't need the world to understand his silence, because in that silence, he has found a strength that words cannot convey. In a world obsessed with productivity, speech, and visibility, Lawrence shows that there is power in quiet resistance. He lives his life without apologies, without the need for others to see him or to validate his existence. Though the world may try to label him, to reduce his life to a single narrative, Lawrence refuses to be defined by their words. He is not a symbol. He is not a spectacle. He is simply a man living on his own terms. The quiet defiance of Lawrence's existence is a reminder that life doesn't have to fit into the molds that society has created. It doesn't have to be loud or visible to have meaning. His existence, though silent, is full of purpose. For Lawrence, the world can watch and judge, but it cannot change the way he lives. His quiet, steady life is an act of resistance in a world that often demands more than what he is willing to give. In the face of the world's gaze, Lawrence stands firm. He is not a tragedy. He is not a spectacle. He is simply a man, living his life in the way that works for him. And that, in itself, is an act of defiance. Lawrence doesn't need to speak for his existence to matter. He doesn't need to perform for anyone. In his silence, he has found his truth. And in that truth, he has found peace. The quiet defiance of Loraine Whittaker is a lesson for us all. It's a reminder that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is to simply be, without seeking approval, without asking for validation, without needing the world to understand us. Through it all, Lawrence continues to live. The world may try to define him, but he remains steadfast in his quiet defiance. His life is his own, and in that, he has found the greatest strength of all: